Hi, everyone. Welcome to the GFPD webinar, Landscape of Current Treatments for Peroxisomal Disorders, What We Learned from the EL-PFDD Meeting, Part 2. I am Katie Sakura, Director of Family Programs here at the GFPD, and I will be your host for tonight's webinar. We will begin with a comprehensive presentation and welcome your questions throughout via the Q&A button or the chat box. If you prefer to remain anonymous, the Q&A option allows for that too. We are joined tonight by three presenters, Pamela Saikali, Nicole Fontes, and Dr. Mousumi Bose. Over the past 2 years, they have been instrumental in collecting and analyzing critical data on peroxisomal disorders and are now in the final stages of preparing the Voice of the Patient report. Pamela Saikali is a registered dietitian in both Lebanon and here in the United States. She earned her bachelor's degree in nutritional sciences from the University of Balamon in Beirut, Lebanon, and she recently completed a master's degree in nutrition and food science from Montclair State University. During her time at Montclair, Pamela worked alongside Dr. Bose on the EL-PFDD project, gaining valuable research experience in the field. Nicole Fontes is a master's student in nutrition and food studies at Montclair State University with a strong passion for advancing research in the rare disease field. Her thesis focuses on improving clinical understanding and treatment strategies for individuals with peroxisomal disorders, particularly Zellweger spectrum disorder. With experience in both qualitative and quantitative research methods, she takes on a multidisciplinary approach for her work. Nicole is deeply committed to improving health outcomes for underserved populations and aspires to build a career at the intersection of rare disease research and medicine. We also have with us Dr. Mousumi Bose. She is the mother of Alon Betzer, who died from Zellweger spectrum disorder in 2011. Inspired by her personal experience, she shifted her career goals to focus on rare disease research. She has conducted research and published multiple papers on the role of the family caregiver in the management of rare pediatric disorders. Dr. Bose holds a faculty position at Montclair State University's Department of Nutrition and Food Studies, where she studies quality of life, patient-focused drug development, dietary assessments, and health equity in rare disease communities. She is passionate about learning what is important to rare disease families and using that information to improve their lives. We are again so thankful to have all three of these presenters here with us tonight to share with all of us. And Dr. Bose, I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie, for that really nice introduction. I'm super excited to be here again and being a part of, this the sharing of some of the things that we found. This is something that's extremely important to us, is making sure that we stay connected with the community and keep you guys informed of, some of the findings of the things that you participated in. So just like the last time that we were here doing this in March, my and my team's goal here is to share with you what we have found in our conversations with our families during the EL-PFDD meeting and all of the preliminary sessions leading up to the EL-PFDD meeting. Our hopes in doing and sharing this with you is to hopefully get some feedback from you as to whether or not you feel like this is a good representation of the overall experience of living with a peroxisomal disorder, and hopefully validating your experience, at least in some ways. And in the case of this particular webinar, maybe even get some ideas for possible treatment options for you or your loved one with a peroxisomal disorder. So I'm going to give away the ending of this talk before I even begin to let you know, and because you guys probably already know this because you live this, is that, the current treatment landscape for peroxisomal disorders right now, there's a lot of limitations. And this includes effectiveness as well as side effects. But everyone's experience here is different. And although this is not necessarily the primary aim of the talk, we're going to be talking very comprehensively in this webinar and in the Voice of the Patient report on the different treatments that everyone who participated in this are using. So there may be some insight here that could be useful to you in the immediate. So maybe we can get to some of that during the Q&A session or, continued conversations afterwards. So this whole effort was something that I am so proud of taking the lead on, but it was certainly not something that I did on my own. You probably already know that Katie was extremely instrumental in helping to organize this meeting and all of our sessions beforehand. And I'm super grateful to Katie for being a partner in that. I also had a research team that helped with a lot of the analysis of the feedback that we got from the community. And so, and they used a lot of this feedback as their part of their master's thesis, what they used to defend and earn their master's degree. So a lot of this information here is their work that I'm just very honored to be presenting here today. So I figured it would be really just a good idea to get them involved in this presentation so you can see some of the hard work that they've put into this project. So I'm gonna first pass the mic over to Pamela Saikali, who co-presented with me in March to start us off and kind of refamiliarizing ourselves with this idea of EL-PFDD. So I'm gonna first switch slides here. And just to give you a very quick overview, this is just what I said. We're going to be reviewing some of the stuff that we did in the March webinar and then really focusing on treatments. And then at the end, we'll talk about next steps. And I look forward to what questions you guys have. So now I will pass the mic over to Pamela to start us off from the beginning.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm not going to spend too much time on explaining what is an EL-PFDD, since many of you have heard me or Dr. Bose talk about this before. But for those of you who are new or need a quick refresher, here's a little brief overview. So about a decade ago, the FDA recognized that the way new treatments were being developed and approved did not really include the voices of patients and their families. So to help address that, the FDA developed this externally led patient-focused drug development, which is the EL-PFDD initiative, which means that patient advocacy groups like the GFPD now have a way to share patients and family stories, your experiences and needs directly with the FDA. So the goal is to ensure that what matters most to patients and caregivers, like your lived experiences, needs, and priorities, are effectively integrated into the process of treatment development and evaluation. So as patients and caregivers, you offer insights that no one else can. And when those insights are shared, they can help better shape better and more meaningful treatments for everyone in the peroxisomal disorders community. And this is exactly what we did in May of 2024, which is to listen to your experiences, and our job is to report your perspectives of priorities and experiences directly to the FDA. Next slide, please. So in participating in this, the GFPD's objectives of this narrative were to describe the most frequent and impactful symptoms and characterize these impacts, the impacts of these symptoms related to peroxisomal disorders, which we touched upon during our webinar in March. And the other objectives of this initiative that we will be touching on today are to examine the effectiveness of the existing treatments and to characterize the many symptoms, the many side effects associated with the available treatments and therapies for peroxisomal disorders. There were additional objectives regarding clinical trial participation and clinical trial needs that we are not going to be covering today, but we will cover in a future webinar. So for this, we recruited primary caregivers of patients with peroxisomal disorders, adult patients with peroxisomal disorders who were able to represent themselves, and the diagnosis of peroxisomal disorders included ZSD, D bifunctional protein deficiency, which is DPP deficiency, AGOX deficiency, AMACR deficiency. And the reason that we did not include other peroxisomal disorders was mainly that they either have a different clinical presentation of the disease or have already existing treatments. Like, for example, an EL-PFDD was previously done for X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy, which is XALD, which is why we did not include XALD in our eligible diagnoses for this EL-PFDD. Next slide. Here's a quick recap of the March webinar where Dr. Bose and I shared our results about the symptoms and how impactful PD symptoms can be and what are the specific impacts. And our main results were that patients on average were dealing with 11 to 12 symptoms at one time, which, as you all know, is a huge impact. Low muscle tone, vision loss, hearing loss, and intellectual disability were the most frequently reported symptoms of peroxisomal disorders. Vision loss was ranked as the symptom with the most impact, and other most very impactful symptoms were mobility symptoms and symptoms of intellectual disability. And the most rated impact in peroxisomal disorders is its effect on independence and being able to perform activities of daily living independently. So if you did not have a chance to attend that webinar, the recording is now available on the GFPD website in the research tab or on the GFPD's YouTube channel. Like I mentioned earlier, I covered more about the symptoms and impacts during the March webinar, and I just gave you a little refresher since the symptoms and impacts were the focus of my thesis. However, today you'll be hearing more from Dr. Bose and Nicole, since the treatment part of this EL-PFDD was actually the focus of Nicole's thesis. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole to dive into the treatments and side effects of peroxisomal disorders.
Hi everyone. As Pamela had said, she already had discussed the data collection portion in the previous webinar, but just to orient you with the information we are presenting today, I will be doing a quick recap. So essentially, we collected data in 3 different phases. First, Pamela and Dr. Bose took charge in running the initial data collection consisting of 4 focus groups and 2 interviews via Zoom. Then I joined and assisted in the development of the caregiver and patient survey in 2024 using the Qualtrics platform. Once we administered the surveys, both the focus group / interviews and survey responses assisted us in the development of the agenda for the town hall meeting, in which many of you were a part of. As many of you can remember, we had specific categories, from symptoms and impacts to what people were doing to treat the disease, which is what I'm going to be focusing on tonight. And we also focused on clinical trials and gathering all the valuable insights you all were able to share during the conference. As you just heard, Pamela covered symptoms and impacts briefly tonight and previously in the March webinar. But I'm going to be focusing more in current treatments and management, and then there will be a webinar talking about future clinical trial participations and needs later on. Next slide. These were the questions related to current treatment and management of symptoms that were included in the focus group and interview guides, which was specifically for caregivers representing patients, but was later modified for questions for patients directly. So these serve as the basis for questions used for both the surveys as well as the town hall meeting discussion. So we had questions like, would you define the PD as being well managed? What worries you most about your child's or loved one's peroxisomal disorder? What are you currently doing to treat your child's or loved one's peroxisomal disorder or its symptoms? How often or how was the treatment regimen change over time and why? And how well does the current treatment regimen treat the most significant symptoms of your child or loved one's disease? As well as what are the most significant downsides to their current treatments and how do they affect their or your daily life? So here it shows that in our focus groups and interviews, we had 42 caregivers representing 47 peroxisomal disorder patients with different diagnoses of PD. I just want to disclose that patients that participated in the study were majority diagnosed with ZSD and were living at the time of the study. This may contribute to the limitation of the study as it might not be as applicable to current patients. So in this table, it shows which focus groups discuss treatment of specific symptoms. The highlighted portions in blue, also marked as with X's indicates that during each of these focus groups or interviews, that a treatment for the symptom category was discussed. Across focus groups and interviews, we found that multiple symptoms were being treated in patients. We will talk about and list those specific treatments later on in the presentation. As for the different symptoms, one example of sensory impairment would be treatments like hearing aids. One example of mobility symptoms would be therapies. Examples of feeding and gastrointestinal symptoms would be G-tubes and Cholbam. One example of bleeding issues and anemia would be blood transfusions. One example of seizures includes medications like Keppra. One example of respiratory symptoms would be oxygen supports. And lastly, an example of adrenal insufficiency would be steroid treatments. So during the focus group interviews, we also asked questions about side effects of treatment. So there were 3 major points that I want to highlight here from this table. First is that side effects were discussed across nearly every single focus group and interview. Second, being that there were side effects that were discussed in nearly every single symptom category of treatment. And third, if you look at the symptom categories, all of the side effects are different, meaning that there are various side effects across each symptom category, not just one. So some specifics of these types of side effects include sensory impairment being frequent mold replacements, mobility symptoms being exhaustion due to therapies, feeding and gastrointestinal symptoms being discomfort from continuous feeding, bleeding issues being gassiness as a result of iron supplementation, seizure treatments being sleepiness and drug interaction concerns, respiratory symptoms being dependency on oxygen, and adrenal insufficiency being reduced ability to fight illnesses. So now let's get into our data of the caregiver and patient survey. So with the help of our initial focus group and interviews, as well as regulatory guidance from the FDA, we developed 2 surveys. One being the patient survey for adult patients, consisting of 33 questions. And the second being the caregiver survey for caregivers of individuals with PD, consisting of 60 questions. Throughout the entire survey, we had questions in the form of multiple choice, ranking, and Likert scale question items, but the majority of the questions asked for the current treatment section were either multiple choice or open-ended format.
So I'm going to take over here. I'm going to be sharing basically our findings from both the survey as well as the town hall meeting data with you. And as Nicole, started sharing about the organization of the survey, I'm going to tell you specifics about some of the questions that were asked that were similar to some of the questions that were asked during the focus groups. So in the survey, one of the sort of quantitative questions that we asked is what symptom categories were they or their loved one treating or had treated previously. And then we basically determined the number of people who reported that they were treating a specific symptom category. So these are the symptom categories that were actually present, that were asked about during the survey. So we asked, what are you doing to, are you taking treatments for sensory impairment, which is vision and hearing loss? Are you receiving treatments, or is your loved one receiving treatments, or have they received treatments for seizures, and so on and so forth? So these are the various symptom categories that we looked at, and I'll have some data showing which symptoms are being treated the most frequently. So that's one way that we looked at this data. Then we asked, once we found out how, which symptoms were being treated, then we asked specifics about what specific treatments are they using or have they used. We tallied all of these numbers up and got whole group numbers, and I'll show you a little bit of that information. We also looked at the sort of average number of treatments per patient that was being represented. And then we went one further step where we broke the treatments themselves up into several categories, which includes medications, and that's anything like your seizure meds or your reflux medications, physical development devices, and that sort of incorporated things like G-tubes or walkers, therapies such as PT, OT, and accommodations like IEPs, supplementation, something like, either iron or fat-soluble vitamin supplementation, and then medical interventions. And that's like surgery to repair or correct something, or blood transfusions. We also included two other categories of treatment type, and that was none. And what that means is when we say none, and you'll see that in some of the information that we're going to be sharing here, when we say none, what that means is that the patient that's being represented in that survey response has the symptom but is not being treated for it currently, or has not been treated for it up until that point. And then we had a not applicable option as well, which means that the patient that was being represented by that survey response did not have that symptom, and as a result of that also was not being treated for that. So this is a lot, I get it, but I'll go over this again as we go through the information that we found. So just to give you an idea of how many people participated in our survey, we had 53 caregivers that were representing 60 patients. We also had 2 adult patients who took the surveys on behalf of themselves when we were administering the survey. Similar to the focus groups, the majority of the patients that were being represented were patients that were diagnosed with ZSD, and the majority of the patients that were being represented were also living patients at the time of the survey. So as Nicole had mentioned, this may serve as a little bit of a limitation in terms of its overall applicability, but I still feel like there's a lot of new insights we're gathering despite these limitations. So let's start with talking about what symptoms are being treated. So the question was, what symptoms are you currently treating, or have you previously treated? And this represents, these numbers, they represent the number of patients that were represented here by these survey responses that had reported they were using treatments for a specific symptom category from this survey data. And what we see here is that the most frequently treated symptom categories were for mobility symptoms, sensory impairment, and once again, that means vision and hearing loss, feeding and GI symptoms, and this all, in that sort of category, that also includes symptoms related to the liver. So this is one type of categorization that we did of treatments, is by the symptoms. But remember, we also looked at breakdown of treatment type, and that's what we have here. This is showing basically, using the data that we collected in the survey, we are looking at the sort of average amount of treatments per patient represented, broken down by treatment type, so that we see on average a patient would use about 4 medications to treat all the symptoms of the disease at one time. Putting all of these treatments together, we found out that patients on average use about 13 treatments total, and that includes all of these categories at one given time. This is probably, again, this is your lived experiences, so this probably speaks to you or your loved one in some kind of way. But in my opinion, this really highlights the considerable burden of management when treating peroxisomal disorders. Another finding, which may or may not be expected across these treatment types, it looks like that families are commonly treating symptoms with medications as opposed to other treatment types. Although, that really oftentimes is dependent on that symptom category. So, these sort of tallies that we've gotten were actually tabulated after we asked survey respondents what were the treatments that they were giving. So this is actually this is actually the information that we got when we asked the surveys. When we asked in the surveys is, what are you treating for vision loss or hearing loss? And here, this is the list of things of treatments that were used. So, and so this chart is really meant to give you an idea of the variety of the types of treatments that were used for each symptom category for peroxisomal disorders. And what we really see here is that there are many types of treatments, and certain symptom categories have lots and lots of treatments, like GI symptoms, like seizures. And I will I'm gonna, as we get towards the closing, I'm gonna talk a little bit about what I feel like that means. But long story short, and we're going to continue on here, is other symptom categories. Long story short, these slides really emphasize how these treatment plans often require multiple medications, multiple interventions, multiple therapies in just the treatment of one symptom category. And not just that, but they range in the different treatment types too. So in certain symptom categories, you'll see medications, physical devices, supplementation, other interventions, all trying to treat just one symptom. So again, I'll talk a little bit as we go further into this discussion as to what I think that means. So the next slide is kind of like trying to quantify all of this information that we've collected here by both symptom category and by treatment type. Once again, we asked respondents to simply list the treatments that they were using across these different symptom categories. And what these numbers that you see here is that among the 60 plus patients that were represented in the survey, this is basically just showing the number of times that they indicated that they were taking any kind of treatment for that symptom. So, for example, across these 60 people that were represented in this survey, it was tallied that they indicated that for, say, if you look at GI treatments, where you see a very big bar there, for GI symptoms, there were at least 40 little tallies of saying that they were treating GI symptoms with something, okay? Sometimes there's a little bit of overlap there, but for the most part, I think this gives us at least a relative idea that there's a lot of different treatments being used for just one symptom, right? And of these 140, tallies or indications, about half of them, of those tallies, were actually marks for medication. So this is really just an aggregate of the data, and I think we as a research team really need to think about how we want to better represent this information. But similar to the other data that I've shown, I think this just really suggests that families, patients are using a lot of different treatments for just one symptom category. And as I get closer to this conclusion, I think really what we're trying to say is, if you're throwing a lot of different medications or a lot of different treatments at one symptom category, that says a lot about how effective or not effective they might be. So one thing to take note of here are the I think in this dark blue color that you see up the top of the majority of these bars, as well as the gray color underneath it, is that not applicable and that none. So once again, not applicable means that they don't have the symptom and therefore are not receiving treatment for it. And so notice the symptoms that are not being treated versus the ones that that some patients don't have. So for example, we see that with intellectual disability is not, people are reporting that they or their loved one have intellectual disability, but they're not actually being treated for it. And that's where you see the none right there. And then if you compare that to something like adrenal insufficiency or with bleeding, where there's a lot less none, but a lot more not applicable, meaning that, there's patients that don't have these symptoms. And there's a couple of nuancy things that I'm gathering from this information. So what first is that if you have a symptom like adrenal insufficiency or bleeding issues, you're likely going to be treating it because it's generally a life-threatening symptom and could be pretty bad if left untreated. Second, with symptoms like intellectual disability or maybe bone issues, where you see a lot more nones, one of the reasons it's probably that they may not be treating it is because it is not as life-threatening as something like adrenal insufficiency or bleeding. But it also is probably speaking to the fact that there's not really a lot of treatments available for these specific symptoms. This is certainly the case with intellectual disability. So, I have some thoughts on this, and you guys might have different thoughts on this. I'm happy to discuss this more in the Q&A and after this webinar. Okay, so this is all I'm going to show regarding of the survey data. I'd like to move on to data from the town hall meeting. And if you remember, during the town hall meeting, we did both a facilitated discussion with panelist remarks and audience participation, but we also did periodic live polling. So I'm going to start with some of the live polling that responses that we did with respect to current treatments. And so this first slide here, we asked the people that were participating in the polling how effective current treatments were for peroxisomal disorders just as a whole in the management of symptoms. And as you can see, more than half of the polling respondents indicated that the current treatments did not manage the peroxisomal disorder symptoms very well. Kind of related, when respondents were asked how has treatment for symptoms of peroxisomal disorders changed over time, the vast majority of the respondents reported that treatment regimens for peroxisomal disorders have increased over time, while very few noted no change or a decrease. So I'm going to move into some of the more qualitative information that we gathered from the town hall meeting. So this is, I really like starting with this quantitative data where you've got numbers and all this stuff, but then really at the heart of this, it's really what, we're looking for perspectives, and perspectives are really more than numbers. So I'm going to be sharing a couple of the quotes from both the town hall session. There may be a few quotes from the focus group intertwined in here, but overall talking about similar topics. So these quotes are broken up by symptom category, and the quotes that we highlighted, this is, remember, the town hall meeting was like an 8-hour day. So this is just a very small snapshot of some of the, some of the feedback that we got. When we get to the voice of the patient report, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, there's a lot more representation of family members here. It's just in the interest of time, I'm sure I'm already running over. In the interest of time, we're just focusing, at adding one example for each of these symptom categories. But you will see comments on both effectiveness as well as sort of like side effects or difficulties and challenges with the specific treatments that we're talking about. So when we're talking about sensory impairment, and this is talking about vision loss and hearing loss, one of the things that that family members brought up was that the sensory aversion that a lot of these patients had not only created challenges with hearing aids, but also with considerations for things like cochlear implants. Even though we know that cochlear implants can be used and are effective in sensory neurohearing loss, these other aspects of peroxisomal disorders, like these sensory aversion issues, kind of render them relatively ineffective or just not used, right? So this is an accessibility issue, right? In the quote to the right, this particular parent was discussing not necessarily treatments, but supports to improve communication, which was regarded as one of the biggest impacts of sensory impairment. But even these supports were not necessarily effective. And this, there were a lot of people would say a lot of reasons that, some of these supports with communication were ineffective. In this particular case, it was due to the patient's apraxia of speech. In other situations, parents or caregivers had said that sometimes the intellectual disability also contributed to the issues with communication. So using the supports weren't really, again, not useful because of the intellectual disability. For mobility symptoms, once again, it was mainly supportive, the types of treatments. So this really highlights how treatment, these quotes, especially the one that you see up in the top left corner, is really meant to show how, needs for treatment, even if it's just supports, increase over time. Somebody talked about how, therapies like PT and OT really take up a lot of time, and and that has a significant impact on the quality of life of both the patient as well as the family. Mobility for bone issues, which then relate back to mobility and weight bearing. We had some families talk about using bisphosphonate medications, which generally are effective, but in some rare cases, there are some pretty significant side effects, which is what this quote here on the right is sharing. And for intellectual disability, when we're talking about intervention and treatments, like there's nothing to improve the intellectual challenges, but supports primarily through school and work-based accommodations. And so you can see here, this parent talked about all of the different accommodations that their child needed in high school because of their intellectual disability challenges. For seizures, what we found is that most of the time, for patients that had seizures, they were taking multiple medications due to not just ineffectiveness, but like loss of effectiveness over time. One of the big conversations surrounding seizures had to do with all of the side effects of the medications. And so what you see on the right is a parent that was talking to their neurologist, and their neurologist straight up just acknowledged that, these are your options. You either have a baby with seizures or you have a baby that's sleepy all the time. And, and this is this sort of this quote is showing the frustration with having these limited options. I will mention that on the quote on the left, the parent that was giving their child all of these medications eventually went on to try a vagal nerve stimulator, and for that parent, that actually was something that was very helpful in controlling seizures during the course of their life of their child. For feeding, as once again, talking about, you saw before with the gastrointestinal symptoms, there was lots of different types of treatments. And here, this quote that you see up on the top, my child has to take a regimen of stuff like Miralax, Dulcolax, mineral oil. It's not just, multiple treatments for a symptom category. It's multiple treatments for just one symptom. And once again, I think this really speaks to a lot of these treatments don't work that effectively. In that sort of realm of gastrointestinal symptoms, we included a treatment for liver symptoms, which, commonly a lot of families take Cholbam. And with Cholbam, it was, there were some families that said that it was very useful in maintaining liver function. And then others said that they did not see an effect. And then still others shared that there were some considerable side effects associated with Cholbam. So when we're talking about bleeding issues, in general, we found that most families related the majority of their child's bleeding issues, if they had them, back to liver dysfunction. So in terms of the management of the bleeding itself, again, it was mainly supportive, not to improve improve the bleeding issues. So this is looking at transfusions, as well as supplementation with iron and vitamin K, and these transfusions would often require frequent hospitalizations, and that in itself carried with it a pretty heavy burden, not to mention that some families talked about needing multiple transfusions very frequently, which, is a heavy burden physically on the patient, logistically for the caregiver, and emotionally for the entire family. And of all the symptoms receiving treatment, it appeared that adrenal insufficiency treatment, which is corticosteroid treatment, was really the most effective compared to the other treatment categories that I described. There were very few families that commented on the ineffectiveness of steroid treatment in any of our sessions, but what a lot of families did say is that these treatments did require a solid adrenal insufficiency diagnosis, which was not often detectable at birth. So generally patients needed to show symptoms before they could be treated for adrenal insufficiency, which in some cases got really severe before they were diagnosed. And then in terms of categories, I'm going to finish up with respiratory symptoms. And respiratory treatments were usually in the form of respiratory support, with a few medications to help improve pulmonary function. One caregiver described the bulkiness and the unwieldiness of the respiratory equipment and tubing, which really just kind of kept their child stationary and confined, even if they could walk. So to summarize all of this, so I'm going to start with these treatment-specific takeaways from everything that we've shared here with you tonight. And in general, we find that across the board, a lot of the treatment for these symptoms are mainly supportive. There is limited effectiveness for a variety of reasons. In the case of sensory impairment, this could be overstimulation, sensory aversion. With seizures, there are a lot of different side effects, especially those related to fatigue, lethargy, and respiratory function. With adrenal insufficiency, the treatment itself is effective, but you need that diagnosis before you can get started on treatment for adrenal insufficiency. For GI symptoms, again, lots and lots of different types of treatments, which, again, I think speaks to the overall ineffectiveness of most treatments. For treatments for the liver, in some cases it was very effective, in others not so much, and there were some side effects that were reported. For bleeding and respiratory, once again, mainly supportive, not really treating this, trying to improve the symptom. So taking all of this together, we all know this first bullet point says there are no treatments that are specific for peroxisomal disorders. It's all symptomatic. We all know this. We say this all the time. So as a result, most of those symptoms are treated with various types of treatments. And within a symptom category, we see lots and lots of different types of treatments in certain symptom categories, like with seizures or with GI treatments. And because we have so many symptoms, a lot of times the multi-symptom nature and the multi-system nature of peroxisomal disorders results in just difficulties with administering treatment. So the treatment might work, but it might not work with peroxisomal disorders because of other symptoms. So, in the case of, say, sensory issues, a lot of times the supports for, say, hearing or vision require you to have the other sense, either hearing or vision, in order for the supports to work. So that effectiveness of one support or treatment may be reduced by the presence of these other symptoms. And then the treatment for one symptom may worsen other symptoms. And this is the case with seizures, where seizure meds can depress the respiratory symptom, and now you've got either exacerbated or new breathing issues. So altogether, I think this suggests that right now the current treatment landscape, it does not address all of the most impactful symptoms of peroxisomal disorders successfully. But that's not to say that we should stop taking treatments right now. We don't have anything better right now. So, we need to rely on these existing treatments until more effective treatments are available. And that sort of comes to this, I'm going to come back to this in just a second, is that this last bullet point that you're going to be getting in this sort of fact sheet on the EL-PFDD meeting, is that there's bottom line, we need new treatments. And hopefully, and this is meant to sort of segue into this idea of, where we have our future webinar on clinical trial participation, because that's how we get new treatments, is by having clinical trials. So that's going to be a really important discussion where we talk about what is it that we want to see fixed, or what do we want to see addressed, and how do we want these clinical trials organized. So going back, I'm going to talk about the, what we're going to be doing next. So just to keep you all updated in terms of where we are in the process of going from, these focus groups to this survey to this EL-PFDD meeting, the major deliverable here is to come up with this voice of the patient report that it summarizes all of this information that we gathered from your feedback. So I am happy to report that we have completed a full draft of this voice of the patient report, and it has been submitted to the FDA to just review. And they're going to come back to us with feedback. And in the meantime, we're going to be working on the layout of the report. And as soon as that we have that final layout and the final go ahead from the FDA with their feedback, we will make that that report available to you all, so you can see a lot more comprehensive information than what I'm sharing here tonight. As I mentioned before, we are planning a third webinar on to share your perspectives on clinical trial participation, hopefully in the fall. And then, we'd really like to take this, this is the whole idea is to give anybody that is interested in designing a clinical trial, a blueprint for what we as a community want in our clinical trials, in our new treatments. But there's a lot of really great, great, and when I say great, I mean like informative information, if that makes sense, that can be used in a lot of different ways. So, I certainly was talking to Katie and Ryan about kind of using some of these findings and using it to help, tweak what we're doing in our patient registry. So, if you are and maybe even the natural history study. So this is going to be my plug to, if you are not enrolled in the natural history study or in the patient registry, this is a good time to do so, because we are expanding. We're using this information to expand out all of the really important information that we can gather to help improve the lives of our families. So this is a fact sheet that you guys are going to be getting on treatments. So not this particular fact sheet, but this is the information that's going to be included in this fact sheet that is either going to be coming out tonight. I'll let Katie talk a little bit about that, or tomorrow. And I just want to take a second to acknowledge my research team, and that's my students. They were amazing in really helping gather all of this data. Their support system, like their thesis committee, obviously the GFPD, our funders, all of the folks within the GFPD that helped with the organization of this meeting, as well as our regulatory stakeholders. So I'm going to take this opportunity to stop now, because I've been talking at you for a minute, and hand it back over to Katie to moderate this last portion of this webinar.
And we're doing great on time, actually.
Yay!
So yes, we're going to move on to the Q&A portion, but first, just a heartfelt thank you to our presenters, Pamela, Saikali, Nicole Fontes, and Dr. Mousumi Bose. We are just really grateful for all of you being here, sharing with us. Your insight and care that each of you brought tonight to this presentation means so much to our community. And we already have had a few questions come in, but please keep them coming to our audience. You can, again, use that Q&A button at the bottom, which allows you to be anonymous if you'd like. We don't say your name either way. And then you can also just use the chat box if that's easier with any of your questions or comments. And I just have one that came in quite earlier on, I think, with just all of this great information that's being shared. One of the questions that makes sense is, what do we do with this information? Like, how do I use this?
That's a really good question, Katie, and I appreciate you asking that. So I've sort of alluded to a couple of things here. Obviously, this is going to be incorporated into the Voice of the Patient report, which is going to be publicly available on the FDA website, so everybody can access this. And this includes any stakeholder, patients, caregivers, and anybody that's involved in the drug or medical product development space, and so they can really see what families want. So that's the primary objective of this, right? That's the major sort of deliverable piece here. However, there's a couple of things that I think that we can do in the immediate, right? Or a little bit more in the immediate. First of all, as I said before, I'm hoping, once we get all of this together, this is, we just had a medical and scientific advisory board meeting on Saturday, and where I shared some of these insights with the medical and scientific advisory board, and it seemed like the overarching thoughts towards this is that this is really useful information. And, I think this will be useful information in terms of determining the sort of directions of the natural history study that's going on at McGill, as well as our patient registry. I'm really hopeful that this information will be incorporated into the overall infrastructure of that patient registry, which will continue to give us, more meaningful information towards understanding what it's like to live with a peroxisomal disorder and what we need as a community in terms of improving the quality of our lives through, treatment available, treatments that are on the horizon, right? So that's one part, right? But one thing that I kind of noticed especially in this particular webinar, is that, even though the overarching message is that most treatments don't work and their side effects, I think, I don't know if there's ever been a place where we have a comprehensive list. I mean, when I say comprehensive, remember, 60 some people participated in these surveys, but, as comprehensive as a list at least up until this point, of all of the different treatments that people have used for treating their different symptoms. So I plan on including in the Voice of the Patient report, as an appendix, basically all of the list of the different treatments. So if there are family members that are struggling with a specific symptom that is hard to treat, maybe this could, even if it might not have worked for another family, it might work for another patient. I will say, just speaking anecdotally, when with my child, we had seizures left and right, and at a certain point, our neurologist had just didn't know what to do. Like, this is, I don't know what to do anymore. I went to the parents in our Facebook group and I said, these are the medications my kid is taking. What are, is there anything else? And somebody had mentioned another seizure medication, which our neurologist prescribed, and we were able to put him on it. So this type of crowdsourcing of information, hopefully will, it might be a useful tool for families, for, thinking a little bit outside the box of like what other people have used. So did that answer your question, Katie?
It very fully answered. Actually, we had someone who asked about, how can this help me right now? And I just want to kind of reiterate that I think that's such a great way that this can help you, because having that list, you may be someone right now who sees that list when it comes out, or even some of the things you saw today on the slides during this presentation, and say, I never thought about that. I didn't even realize that that was a potential treatment option. And you can take this back to your healthcare team and say, hey, can we talk about this? This is something that somebody else tried. Or like you said, go back to our own community members and say, hey, is anybody willing to share? Was this you? Have you tried this? I'm interested in hearing about your experience. So I just think that's such great advice for how this can help you right now.
And it wasn't even like something that as when Nicole and I were putting all of this information together and putting this list together, I was like, I didn't know people took, this medication for this symptom. And that's when I started thinking about, well, maybe this information will be useful now,
It's so important. I think it's really going to benefit so many people. Each time I see something get published or put out with the research and the data, it just really validates and helps our community be able to advocate for their care at a higher level. So I also wanted to ask, the patient registry has been brought up more than once. Could you share, how can the patient registry connect with this information? What would that look like in the future? Why is that so important?
With the patient registry, the idea of a patient registry is sort of like a way to just collect information of what's going on in a patient's life, over a period of time. This is meant to be a longitudinal like survey of information that families are asked, in terms of symptoms and treatments. And I feel like as we get more insights on, what's working, what's not working, how are things being treated, what are the most impactful symptoms, it'll help us really hone in on first of all, if we go back to symptoms, what are the symptoms that we should be asking about that we haven't? And then is there a specific, category of treatment that that we have not asked about in this patient registry, and do we need to include it now, especially if people are, if especially if a lot of people are saying, hey, I've used this type of treatment and it's not being accounted for in the registry. So I really feel like information like this from the EL-PFDD meeting will help us determine what is necessary to include in the patient registry, and maybe what is, on the flip side of that, might give us, some of the, as we all know, we take these, and I know that I'm guilty of this. I've made so many of you take so many surveys at so many different time points. And I don't do this because I am mean. It's because I really want this information. But I feel like this type of insight will give us ideas of how can we, even pare down some of these surveys if necessary, so that we're not creating undue burden on our families in asking these questions. Does that make sense, Katie?
It does. And as a family, I appreciate that too. So I think that's all of our questions. I'm just going to give one more moment to open it up. Nicole Fontes, Pamela Saikali, thank you for being here too. If you had anything to add in, Dr. Bose, is there anything else that you wanted to add as well before I just share a few more things with our community?
No, I think I'm real, like, it brings me a lot of, this is like the most important part of this project for me, is sharing this information with you guys. You guys participated in this, and this is like, I look forward to continuing this conversation. Most of you know how to get a hold of me if you have any additional questions, or any additional discussions you want to have. Katie, I'm sure you'll share my information if people don't have that information. So I encourage you. This is about you or your child or your family member. If there are things here that resonates with you, I'd love for you to share that with us. If there are things that you feel like may not be represented as well as, I want you to share that with us. This is all really important information. So that's really all I have to say.
And I couldn't agree more. It's crucial data that I'm just grateful for all of you being here, sharing it with our community. And to echo what you even just said to our audience, we want to continue to have this conversation beyond this space. We actually have a one-pager that's been developed that I will share with all of our audience and beyond. We'll make sure that gets out. That's going to follow this webinar. And we just really hope that all of these insights we've shared just continue to guide and continue collaboration, advocacy, research, and ultimately just make a difference in the individuals with peroxisomal disorders. I want to echo again, if you missed part 1 of this webinar series, no worries. Part 1 is recorded, and it is on the GFPD YouTube channel. And tonight's webinar has been recorded and will be there soon too. And on your screen, you see a QR code. This is a great way to stay up to date, to know when this webinar recording is going to be released. When is the next webinar? When is the Voice of the Patient report going to be released? All of these great things, these great updates, you will know about them by making sure you're receiving the GFPD Top 3 newsletter and following us on social media. But if you're not getting that Top 3 newsletter from us, you can go ahead and scan there. You can email me. You can go to the contact us at the website. Let us know. I'm not receiving it. We will make sure that you are. I want to give a special thanks to Miriam for sponsoring this webinar and enabling the GFPD to provide these valuable discussions and learn. These are just great learning experiences for our entire community. We also ask that you please take a moment to complete the survey that will be sent to you after the webinar. And I thank you again, Pamela, Nicole, Dr. Bose. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and the time that you have taken to share with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, and have a great night.